A common HTML attribute, especially on span or input elements, is an ID. The ID attribute uniquely identifies an element. We can use the ID as a selector to select that one element and style it. But what if we have another span element on our page, and we want to style it the same way? Since the ID is unique, we can't reuse it. We could give this span its own ID and style both spans by ID, but that doesn't scale well as we add more spans. A better option is the HTML class attribute. With the class attribute, we use the same class name on any elements we want to style the same. We give the class attribute a meaningful name, highlight in this example. Then put that same name on any other elements we want styled the same. We use this class name as a selector to select every element with this class, and then style them. Here's a tip. When defining class names, use names that describe the purpose of the class, not the style. For example, highlight, not yellow. That way, if the style changes over time, the class name still makes sense. Note that a class name is case-sensitive and must exactly match on each element. The other benefit of using a class attribute is that we can assign multiple classes. We can add multiple classes here, separated with a space. In this example, the span is styled as declared in the highlight and keypoint selector style rules. In prior clips, we covered these selectors. Here are a few more. The hash or pound sign indicates an ID selector. An ID selector matches an element based on its ID attribute. Since the ID attribute must be unique within a web page, this technique selects a single element for styling. A dot or period denotes a class selector. The browser finds all elements with a class attribute matching this class name. This is a great option for controlling which elements are selected for styling. It's best practice to use class selectors for the majority of our styling. We can also use the class selector with an element type to locate the class attribute only on elements of that type. For example, styling only div elements with a class of highlight. Let's try these out. In our resume project, we'll implement the ID and class selectors. We are again in VS Code with the resume folder open on the left and the browser on the right. Let's try out the ID selector first. We need an HTML ID attribute on one of our elements. In the index.html file, we'll add a span element. Let's add it to some key text that we want to highlight in our resume. We'll add it around extensive experience. Note that VS Code adds our closing tag for us. Drag it after extensive experience. Then we add an ID attribute and assign the ID a value so it's unique on the page. We'll set it to extensive. Note that nothing is different in the browser. In the style sheet, at the bottom, we use a hash symbol to add an ID selector and type in the ID of our span element, which is extensive. That's our selector. In the style declaration, we set the text color to dark slate gray, the font style to italic, and the font weight to bold. Looking at the browser, now the text stands out. We also want to highlight the position we're looking for. In index.html, let's add another span element around entry-level position, and again drag the closing tag after the text. Now what? An ID is supposed to be unique, so we can't use that same ID here. How do we style this span without repeating the code in the style sheet? Well, we could define a type selector for all span elements, but that's a bit risky because over time we may add other span elements to the page. Is there a better option? If you set a class attribute, you are correct. We'll give each span we want to highlight an HTML class attribute of highlight, both this one and our original one. That way, we control exactly which elements are selected for styling. How did we come up with the name highlight? We can name our classes anything we want, but should select something descriptive. In the style sheet, at the bottom, we use a dot and the class name for the selector, which in this example is highlight. We can then set any style properties. We'll move the color and font weight properties to the class selector and delete the empty lines. Looking at the browser, both sets of text have the new style, and only the first span has italics. We have a few more selectors to cover, so let's leave our layout and go back to the slides. So, we covered several additional selectors for identifying elements for styling. Use the hash or # for an ID selector. An ID selector styles a single element, selecting it by its HTML ID attribute. Use a dot or period for a class selector. A class selector gives us control over exactly which elements are selected for styling using the HTML class attribute. The class selector selects each element with the specified class attribute value. Use a good class name that describes the purpose, not the style. So use key-word-emphasis instead of text-orange, and section-header instead of heading-bold. That way, if the style later changes, the class name still makes sense. Class selectors are often the best choice for selecting which elements to style. Combine a class selector with an element type to style only elements of that type and with that class attribute. Let's check out the attribute selector next. And don't forget to like and subscribe.